Makeup artist's brush swept across my cheek, a soft, final touch on a face that felt like a mask. I sat before the ornate vanity, a doll being prepped for display. They had woken me before dawn, a flurry of activity to dress and paint me for my own wedding, a ceremony that felt more like a sentencing. The groom was Julian Sterling, and until a month ago, he had been my sister's fiancé. The heavy bedroom door creaked open, and the sharp, rhythmic click of high heels on the polished floor announced Chloe's arrival. She stopped behind me, her reflection appearing next to mine in the mirror, a smirk playing on her lips. She looked down at me, her expression a mixture of pity and contempt. "Elara," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You're finally marrying Julian. You must be so happy." I met her gaze in the mirror, my own expression carefully neutral. "Oh, I am," I replied, my voice smooth and even. "I'm very happy. I just hope you don't come to regret this later on." Chloe let out a peal of laughter, clutching her stomach as if I'd told the most hilarious joke. "Regret it? Ilara, are you living in a fantasy? Why would I ever regret getting rid of that cripple? My life can only improve now that I'm free of that burden." Just a month ago, Julian Sterling was indeed Chloe's problem to solve. The Vance family and the Sterling family had a long-standing marriage arrangement, a pact made generations ago that bound the eldest daughter of our family to the eldest son of theirs. Everyone assumed that meant Chloe would marry Marcus Sterling, the handsome and charismatic second son. But a year ago, the Sterling family had a skeleton dragged from their closet. Julian, an illegitimate son who had grown up in hardship, returning to the family fold thin, quiet, and with a pronounced limp from an old injury. He was, however, technically the eldest son. For the sake of our family's reputation and the lucrative ties to the Sterlings, Chloe was expected to honor the agreement. She responded by throwing tantrums for days, her histrionics leaving our parents, who had always doted on her, at a loss. They couldn't stand the thought of their precious daughter being shackled to what they saw as a miserable fate. So their eyes turned to me. They summoned me back from the quiet life I'd been living in the countryside, the forgotten daughter brought out to serve as a substitute. I would marry Julian in Chloe's place. In my previous life, that's not what happened. Chloe married Julian. And just as his business ventures began to flourish, making him a formidable power in his own right, she betrayed him. She leaked his company's confidential information to his half-brother, Marcus, leading to Julian's complete ruin and, ultimately, his tragic death. But this time, in this new life, things were different. For reasons I didn't yet understand, Chloe had successfully convinced everyone to let me be the sacrificial lamb. I allowed a small, knowing smirk to touch my own lips as I looked at her reflection. "Don't celebrate too early, sister," I said, my voice low. "The story isn't over yet." With that, I stood, the silk of my wedding gown whispering around me, and walked out of the dressing room, leaving her standing there. The ending was far from written because, this time, I had been reborn. Later, in the grand hall of the Sterling estate, a hush fell over the assembled guests as Julian was wheeled in. A wave of sighs and quiet murmurs rippled through the crowd. I watched him from my place at the altar, my gaze cutting through the sea of faces. He looked even paler and thinner than he had a year ago, a fragile figure in a perfectly tailored suit. But only I knew the truth. Only I knew that this man, dismissed by everyone as a broken footnote in the Sterling family history, would one day become the most powerful and feared man in the entire city. At the wedding in my past life, Chloe had wept through the entire ceremony, her misery a public spectacle. This time, I stood calmly and recited my vows, my voice clear and steady. Amidst the curious, pitying, and mocking gazes of the city's elite, Julian Sterling and I completed our mismatched wedding. I was now Mrs. Julian Sterling. After the reception, it was clear that Julian couldn't continue to live in the main Sterling mansion, under the thumb of his stepmother and half-brother. We were moved to a separate, smaller house on the estate grounds. Once we were inside and the staff had left us alone, Julian slowly, painfully, pushed himself up from his wheelchair. He started limping towards me, his jaw tight with effort. I moved forward instinctively to help him, but he shoved my hand away. "I don't need your pity," he said, his voice cold and sharp. Indifference radiated from him, a wall of ice. I froze for a second, then a wave of understanding washed over me. Julian had endured a lifetime of hardship, and even his return to the wealthy Sterling family had only brought him more humiliation at the hands of Marcus and his mother. It was only natural that he would be sensitive, defensive, and quick to see pity where there was none. I ignored his resistance and stepped forward again, firmly taking his arm and guiding him towards the sofa. "We're married now," I said, my tone gentle but firm. "That makes us a family. You don't need to push my help away." His eyes widened slightly in surprise, the coldness in them receding for a brief moment. A flicker of something else, warmth perhaps, softened his gaze. I smiled, satisfied. I knew that anyone who had suffered as much as he had would be profoundly moved by the first taste of genuine kindness. I had made my decision. I would be a good wife to him, a true partner. I would help him gain the power he was destined for, and then I would use that power to bring down the family that had used me as a pawn, my own. To do that, I first had to win him over completely. The next day, Julian and I went to the main Sterling mansion for a formal visit with his parents. The Sterlings were a far more influential and powerful family than the Vances. If not for the generations-old marriage contract, my family would never have been able to associate with them on this level. Mr. Sterling greeted us warmly, inviting us to sit. He carried a heavy burden of guilt regarding Julian and was always trying, in his own way, to make up for the lost years. In my past life, he had been Julian's staunchest supporter during the power struggle with Marcus. Unfortunately, Marcus's mother's family was immensely powerful, and they ultimately provided the leverage that allowed Marcus to win, crushing Julian completely. Mrs. Sterling, on the other hand, made no effort to hide her displeasure at our visit. She covered her nose with a handkerchief and gave a series of dramatic, delicate coughs. "If someone is unwell, they should stay at home and recuperate," she said, her sharp eyes fixed on Julian. "Spreading germs and bad luck to others is simply unacceptable. My Marcus has a very delicate constitution." Marcus, sitting beside her, shot Julian a provocative, triumphant glance. Julian's face turned a shade paler, but he remained silent, his hands clenched in his lap. He was accustomed to their taunts and insults. Mr. Sterling's brow furrowed in disapproval, but he said nothing to his wife. Bringing an illegitimate son home had been a contentious act, and he seemed to feel his only recourse was to privately encourage Julian to endure the verbal abuse from his wife and other son, and I decided I had seen enough. I picked up a piece of choice meat with my chopsticks, placed it in Julian's bowl, and smiled brightly at him. "Yes, dear, you should eat more to get your strength back," I chimed in, my voice carrying across the silent dining table. "We still have to think about having children in the future, after all." My bold declaration left the entire table stunned. No one had expected me to so readily and publicly embrace my role as Mrs. Julian Sterling. Julian himself looked taken aback for a moment, but then a flicker of understanding crossed his face. He realized I was defending him. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, and he reciprocated, placing some food on my plate. Mrs. Sterling couldn't tolerate our display of unity. She slammed her chopsticks down on the table, announced she was feeling unwell, and demanded Marcus help her back to her room. With that, the tense family dinner came to an abrupt and sour end. Later, sitting in the car on the way back to our house, Julian gently took my hand. His own was cool to the touch. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Alara," he began, his voice quiet. "Don't you feel wronged being married to someone like me? A cripple?" I squeezed his hand tightly, turning to look at him directly. "How could I feel wronged?" I said, my voice filled with a conviction that surprised even me. "It's just a physical imperfection. There are people walking around with perfectly healthy bodies who have enormous deficiencies on the inside, and they still enjoy wealth and luxury. Why shouldn't you deserve the same?" As I spoke, my thoughts turned to the tragedies of my past life, and my eyes darkened. I made a silent vow. This time, I would help Julian change his fate. I would support his ambitions, and I would make sure that everyone who ever looked down on us would live to regret it. The people who harmed us would pay their price. The fragile piece of our new life didn't last long. Soon enough, Chloe came looking for me, When my assistant at the design studio I had opened buzzed my office to tell me that my sister was in the lobby, I instinctively frowned. It was like a fox paying a friendly visit to the henhouse. She couldn't possibly have good intentions. Still, I couldn't very well refuse to see her. I told my assistant to send her in, bracing myself for whatever scheme she was about to propose. She swept into my office with her usual air of arrogance, casually tossing her expensive designer handbag onto my work desk, scattering a set of my design drafts onto the floor. I didn't stoop to pick them up. I simply frowned at her. "Miss Vance," I said, using her formal name. "What brings you here today?" I had been reborn a year ago, at the exact moment Julian first returned to the Sterling family and my own family dragged me back from the countryside to be Chloe's stand-in. In my first life, I had obediently stayed home, a quiet and unassuming daughter. I didn't compete for the family inheritance or a position in the company. All I wanted was to live a peaceful existence. But Chloe wouldn't allow it. She hated that I was free to find love while she was trapped in an arranged marriage to a man she despised. She resented that our grandmother had left me her entire savings, allowing me to live comfortably. So she schemed to ruin my reputation, turning me into a pariah until, broken and humiliated, I took my own life. She had to see me as miserable as she was. Having been given a second chance, I refused to repeat those mistakes. I wouldn't sit at home and wait for others to destroy me. I opened my own studio to forge my own path and set my own plans in motion. "Alara, you know Julian isn't in good health," Chloe began, her tone surprisingly gentle and conspiratorial. "A cripple? An illegitimate son? You must know who will ultimately hold power in the Sterling family, right?" My frown deepened. "What are you getting at, Chloe? I have a lot of work to do and my time is valuable. If you can't get to the point, please leave." I had my suspicions, but I wanted to hear her say it. She dropped the pretense of sisterly concern. "Marcus wants to work with you," she said, her voice dropping. "You know that even though he's the second son, he has the full backing of his mother's family. It's almost a certainty that he'll win the battle for control of Sterling Corp." "Oh?" I raised an eyebrow, leaning back in my chair. "Then why would Marcus want to work with me? Even without his mother's support, it's quite obvious that Mr. Sterling dotes on Julian." Chloe's patience snapped. No matter how much the old man dotes on him, he's not going to hand his entire empire over to a bastard. And look at him, he's nothing but skin and bones. He probably won't even live long. "I'm doing you a favor, thinking of you as my sister. I don't want to see you end up a lonely widow. I'm giving you an opportunity." The idea that Chloe cared about my welfare was so absurd I almost laughed. "So what is it that you want?" I asked finally. A smug, triumphant look returned to her face. "You don't have to do much. Just keep an eye on Julian. Report back on any company secrets you overhear, and when the time is right, you'll need to help Marcus tamper with or steal a few documents." This time, I did laugh. "Do you realize that what you're proposing is illegal, and you're brazen enough to say it out loud in my office?" Chloe froze, her face paling as she realized she had been tricked into revealing her entire plan. Before she could form a response, I cut her off. "Forget it. Julian and I have a loving, happy marriage. There's no opportunity here for you to exploit. And I will, of course, be informing my husband about this little conversation. Thank you for the warning." Her face turned beet red with rage. "Ilara, don't you dare be so disrespectful. You will regret this," she shouted. "We'll see who regrets what in the end," I said, meeting her gaze without a trace of fear. I pressed the button on my intercom. "Assistant, please call security and have Miss Vance escorted from the building." Fuming, Chloe stomped out of my office. As I watched her retreating back, the tension finally drained from my muscles. The memories of the torment she had put me through in my past life were still vivid, and even now, just seeing her made my entire body tense up in defense. It was a strange twist of fate. In my past life, I hadn't married Julian, and Chloe still came to me, trying to persuade me to become an informant against him for Marcus's sake. It made a sick kind of sense. Growing up, Chloe had always been told her future husband would be the young master of the Sterling family, and she had developed a deep infatuation with Marcus. She was so hopelessly in love with him that she ignored his constant philandering. In our previous life, she had been willing to risk a prison sentence to help him seize control of the family fortune. But I wasn't Chloe. I wasn't so easily manipulated by false promises. And most importantly, Marcus had been her willing accomplice in many of her cruelest acts against me. They were my enemies, and I was determined to get my revenge on them both. When I got home that evening, I hesitated for only a moment before deciding to tell Julian everything. Chloe came to my office today, I began, watching his reaction. He seemed surprised that I would bring it up. She said that Marcus wants to collaborate with me. I refused. I recounted the entire conversation honestly, leaving nothing out. You need to be careful of the people around you, I finished, especially anyone who has access to confidential files at your company. In our past life, Chloe had been able to steal sensitive documents from Julian's company far too easily, which meant she must have had an accomplice on the inside. After I finished speaking, Julian's expression turned serious. He seemed genuinely surprised by my decision. "Why did you refuse him?" he asked, his voice quiet. His offer must have been very tempting. The question stunned me. I thought for a moment, a surge of unexpected anger rising within me. "Because I love you," I said, the words feeling truer than I'd anticipated. "I'm your wife. We are in this together, and I will not abandon you. Why can't you trust me? Or is it that you can't believe someone could actually love you without an ulterior motive?" I looked at his pale, handsome face, which always seemed to carry a shadow of sickness and sorrow, and I felt a sudden, profound sadness for him. This brilliant, insecure man had finally opened his heart to his wife in our last life, only to be utterly destroyed by the one person he trusted most. Julian stared at me for a long, silent moment, his lips trembling slightly. Then, suddenly, he pulled me into a fierce, tight hug, as if he were trying to merge our two bodies into one. His voice was a raw whisper against my hair. "Ilara," he pleaded, "please, don't ever betray me. You're all I have left." During the new year, Julian and I were obligated to return to the Sterling mansion for the family dinner. The atmosphere was always fraught with tension, and I squeezed Julian's hand reassuringly as we got out of the car. He looked up at me and offered a small, grateful smile. Over the past few months, our relationship had slowly deepened, and he was finally beginning to let his guard down and open up to me. Inside, Mrs. Sterling and Marcus treated us with the same disdain they had shown 6 months ago. If anything, Marcus's eyes held an even greater degree of hostility, likely because I had so flatly rejected his offer of collaboration. It was clear he hadn't given up. Later in the evening, as I was coming out of a downstairs restroom, a shadow lunged from a darkened alcove, grabbing me forcefully and dragging me back inside. I struggled in the near-total darkness, the dim light filtering in from the hallway, revealing my attacker's face. It was Marcus. In the confined space, with his heavy breathing in my ear and my body restrained, I couldn't help but be thrown back to the cold, terrifying night in my past life when Chloe had framed me, leading to me being assaulted by a criminal she'd hired. Luckily, it was winter, and I was wearing several layers of clothing. Marcus pinned me against the cold marble of the sink, his grip like iron. "Ilara," he breathed into my ear, his voice low and menacing. "I'll give you one more chance. Join me. It's a much better option than staying with that cripple." His voice was sickeningly close, and he cruelly nipped my earlobe, making me shiver with revulsion. "No," I managed to say, mustering all my strength. "I won't." Tears of fear and rage pricked at my eyes. "Oh, and why is that? Don't tell me you've actually fallen for that pathetic excuse for a man? Can he even satisfy you? If you come with me, I promise I won't treat you badly. And at this point, you don't have another choice." He began fumbling with my clothes and a scream tore from my throat, but he quickly clamped a hand over my mouth. My strength was fading, and just as I felt a wave of despair wash over me, the bathroom door was thrown open with such force that it slammed against the wall. I saw Julian stumble into the room, his face a mask of fury. Seeing someone else there, Marcus momentarily loosened his grip. I seized the opportunity, shoving him away with all my might and scrambling into Julian's arms. The fear and violation of the moment finally broke through my composure, and I began to sob. Julian held me tightly, gently patting my back and whispering words of comfort. Marcus simply straightened his tie, a smirk playing on his lips. Behind Julian, we heard the frantic footsteps of Mr. and Mrs. Sterling approaching. But Marcus wasn't panicked in the slightest. He casually waited for them to enter and witness the scene. Mr. Sterling was so furious, his hand shook on his cane. He pointed a trembling finger at Marcus, about to speak, but Marcus was faster. "Dad, she seduced me," he said, his voice a smooth, convincing lie. "She was waiting for me outside the restroom, and when she saw me, she jumped on me and pulled me inside. She told me she preferred me, that my brother couldn't satisfy her, and that he wasn't half the man I am." He dragged his words out, his eyes landing provocatively on Julian. I looked up at my husband, whose already pale face had turned as white as a sheet. "I didn't," I whispered desperately. "It wasn't me." "I know," Julian said, his voice firm as he pressed my head back into his chest, shielding me. "I believe you." The truth of the situation was obvious to anyone with eyes, but in the twisted reality of a powerful family like the Sterlings, the truth was a commodity that could be bought and sold. Mr. Sterling slammed his cane onto the marble floor, the sharp crack echoing through the mansion. You... He was so enraged he could barely speak. He had been in declining health for years, but he had never expected his own son to commit such a disgraceful act right under his own roof. Mrs. Sterling cut him off. "Henry has always been a well-behaved boy," she declared, stepping forward to stand by her son. "With all the beautiful young women from wealthy families chasing after him, why would he possibly be interested in a married woman? It must have been this vixen who seduced him." She pointed an accusatory finger at me. "Yes, Mom, you know me best," Marcus said, playing the part of the wronged victim perfectly. "My poor boy, you've been wronged," Mrs. Sterling cooed, patting his hand. "Besides," Marcus added, his gaze a direct challenge to Julian, "I can't be sure that if we continue to live under the same roof, my dear sister-in-law won't try something even more outrageous." "A bastard and a vixen who throws herself at her own brother-in-law," Mrs. Sterling shrieked. "You've clearly inherited every bit of your disgraceful mother's character." "Enough!" Mr. Howard roared, banging his cane again, his whole body shaking as if he were about to collapse. Julian released me and stepped forward to steady his father. When he turned back to face his brother and the stepmother, his gaze was as cold and sharp as ice. "I will leave the Sterling family," he said, his voice ringing with cold finality. "I will start my own business. I won't fight you for control of Sterling Corp." His declaration left everyone stunned. Marcus and his mother had never expected Julian to give up his claim so easily. I was frozen in place as well. In my previous life, Julian had left the family to start his own company, but that had been 3 years later. What had happened to accelerate everything so drastically? Could my rebirth have triggered some kind of butterfly effect? But I felt like I hadn't done anything significant enough to change the timeline this much. After we left the mansion that night, my relationship with Julian deepened. In that critical moment, I had seen his genuine fear and concern for me. He had noticed we were both missing from the dinner, and, sensing something was wrong, had rushed to find me without even taking the time to grab his cane or his wheelchair. Once he was free from the Sterling family, I could see a weight lift from his shoulders. He seemed more relaxed, no longer having to endure the daily pressure and verbal jabs from Marcus and his mother. With some initial, discreet help from Mr. Sterling, Julian's new company was established and quickly began to thrive. In less than 2 years, he had made a significant name for himself in the business world of our city. People began to say he had the same brilliant, ruthless spark his father had in his heyday. At the beginning of the year, we attended a major land auction. I was browsed through the auction catalog when a particular listing caught my eye, sparking a sense of déjà vu. The first item up for bid was a piece of land where a suburban sewage treatment plant had once stood. The suburban sewage treatment plant. I looked up suddenly, a vivid memory from my past life flashing through my mind. Not long after this very auction, the city government had designated that exact area as the site for a new, major metro station. It was set to become a crucial transit hub connecting our city with the neighboring metropolis. The government ended up buying the land back from the winning bidder for several times the auction price. I was just about to turn and tell Julian that he had to bid on this land, no matter the cost, when he calmly raised his paddle. "1 million, he said, his voice clear and steady. A murmur went through the crowd. Everyone knew that the old sewage plant had been abandoned for years and the land was considered polluted and useless. It couldn't be used for development or agriculture, and its suburban location made it undesirable. No one was going to challenge him for a piece of wasteland. Marcus, sitting in the front row, turned in his seat to stare at us, his face a mask of ridicule. Our eyes met, and his were filled with mockery. For the rest of the auction, Julian didn't make a single other bid. When the event concluded and people began to file out, Marcus deliberately blocked our path. He looked down his nose at us and sneered. Wasting the old man's money on a worthless piece of dirt? He must be truly going blind to ever think you could be his successor. His tone was thick with jealousy. Julian completely ignored him, not even bothering to glance in his direction. He simply took my hand, and we walked out through a side door, leaving Marcus fuming behind us. A few months later, when the news broke that the government was buying the abandoned sewage plant land for $5 million, Marcus was reportedly furious. But a strange, unsettling feeling stirred within me. How could Julian have known that land would become so valuable? A terrifying suspicion began to form in my mind. From agreeing to the changed marriage arrangement to this incredibly shrewd land purchase, all the major deviations from my past life's timeline hadn't originated from me. All of the butterfly effects, all the real changes had come from Julian. Could it be possible? Could Julian have been reborn too? If I could come back, why couldn't he? After all, both of us had met with tragic, unjust ends in our previous life. Once that thought took root, I found myself constantly observing him, testing him in subtle ways. But Julian was meticulous, his actions precise, and his emotions carefully guarded. He never left an opening. The sewage plant deal not only netted us a handsome profit, but also earned Julian immense respect within the business community. More and more shareholders within Sterling Corp began to voice their desire for him to return and take over the company. Faced with this growing pressure, Chloe and Marcus grew increasingly restless. One afternoon, when I brought lunch to Julian's office, I happened to arrive just as Chloe was being shown in to see him. Julian and I exchanged a quick, knowing glance. A sudden curiosity sparked within me. What could she possibly want from him now? I slipped into a small anteroom just off his main office, deciding to hide behind the door and listen. The door creaked open. I couldn't see them, but I could hear their voices clearly. "Julian," Chloe began, her voice sickeningly sweet. I heard some hurried footsteps, followed by Julian's cold, sharp voice. "Miss Vance, stop right there. It's inappropriate for a man and a woman to be so close, especially when I am a married man. Married to your sister, no less." "Julian, you know it should have been me marrying you," Chloe said hurriedly. "We missed our chance 3 years ago. But if I'm willing now, do you still want me?" As she spoke, I heard her try to move closer and the sound of Julian taking a few steps back. It was honestly unexpected, yet somehow completely logical, that Chloe would now try to align herself with Julian. In this life, she hadn't married him, but Marcus had also made it clear he had no intention of marrying her. He had his pick of women, and now that Chloe was no longer useful to him, he had discarded her without a second thought. Everyone in their social circle knew about their long-standing affair, and now, at her age, Chloe was in a panic. She needed to find a suitable husband fast. It was astonishing that she would now come crawling to the man she once looked down on with such disgust. Perhaps I was cracking the sunflower seeds I'd brought with my lunch a little too loudly, because Chloe suddenly yelled in my direction. "Who's there?" I stepped out from behind the door, innocently holding up my hands to show her the seeds. "You," she snapped, her face flushing with anger and embarrassment. "What were you doing eavesdropping? What did you hear?" "Oh, nothing much," I said nonchalantly, walking past her and seating myself in Julian's large leather office chair, feeling every bit the lady of the house. "Just that you want to be Julian's, what is it, concubine? Or is mistress the more modern term?" "Concubine! Don't you dare insult me, Alara!" she shrieked, lunging at me. But Julian stepped between us, pushing her back with a firm, steady hand. "Oh, did I get it wrong?" I continued, leaning back in the chair. "You just want to share a husband with your sister, correct? That's what a concubine was in ancient times. But that's not a decision Julian can make. I make the decisions in our household." Julian simply smiled indulgently at me, not arguing the point. "You should be asking me for permission. After all, the main wife was always the one to approve of such arrangements. I looked at her, my gaze challenging. Knowing she had no ground to stand on, Chloe let out a frustrated scream, turned, and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind her. "Did I say something wrong, dear?" I asked Julian, batting my eyelashes at him playfully. He walked over and patted my head tenderly. "Whatever my wife says is right," he said, a warm smile in his eyes. Then he added, "But for the record, your husband has no intention of ever taking any concubines." Meanwhile, Marcus was growing even more desperate than Chloe. Over the past 2 years, Mr. Sterling's health had continued to decline, and most of the day-to-day affairs of the company were being managed by Marcus. But just as in our past life, he could barely maintain the company's status quo. Under his leadership, Sterling Corp was beginning to show signs of decline. The shareholders' demands for Julian to return and take over grew louder. Although Julian had left the Sterling family, he had never formally relinquished his inheritance rights. Legally, he was still qualified to compete for control of the company. Marcus was panicking. One night, Julian and I were woken by an urgent phone call. It was Marcus. We exchanged worried glances in the darkness. As expected, Marcus's anxious voice came through the receiver, stark and strained. "Dad, he's not going to make it. He wants to see you one last time. You need to come home, quickly." We hurriedly dressed and drove to the Sterling estate. Mr. Sterling had lived for a few more years in the previous life, but because of the cascade of butterfly effects, nearly everything in this world had been accelerated. His death, while tragic, was not unexpected. The estate was brightly lit, a hive of tense activity. Julian held my hand tightly as we walked inside, and I could feel his palms sweating. Mr. Sterling hadn't been a perfect father, but over the past few years we had both seen his guilt and his genuine efforts to make amends to Julian. Despite any lingering resentment, the finality of his father's passing stirred complicated emotions in my husband. We were stopped at the door to Mr. Sterling's bedroom. We waited for a long time before Marcus finally emerged. He allowed Julian to enter, but blocked my way with his arm. "This is a family matter, Alara. You have no place here for Mr. Sterling's final words." I pressed my lips together, but said nothing, choosing instead to wait anxiously in the hallway. Time stretched on. Julian didn't come out. I grew increasingly worried, a cold fear creeping into my heart that something had happened to him, but I couldn't rush in. "Worried about your husband, sister-in-law?" Marcus's voice, now eerily calm, came from behind me. The urgency from his phone call was completely gone. I glared at him, ignoring the taunt. He wasn't annoyed by my silence. He just smiled. "3 years ago, you turned me down in this very house. I wonder if you'll regret that decision after tonight." A chill ran down my spine. Something was terribly wrong. Just then, a man wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face approached Marcus and whispered something to him. I couldn't see his face clearly, but something about his build and profile seemed familiar. At that exact moment, several police officers entered the house, showed their badges, and announced, "We're from the Economic Crimes Division. We received a tip that Mr. Julian Sterling is involved in large-scale tax evasion and money laundering. We have substantial evidence. Mr. Sterling needs to come with us for investigation." I was stunned. I instinctively looked at Marcus, who just shrugged, though the look of triumph in his eyes was unmistakable. "Officer, someone is framing him," I pleaded. "He's a law-abiding citizen. He would never do such things." But my words were useless. No one listened. I could only watch, helpless and terrified, as the police entered the bedroom and led Julian away. The shock of the scene was too much for Mr. Sterling. His breathing grew rapid and shallow, and in the middle of the night, he passed away. The farcical, nightmarish night finally ended as the sun began to rise. As everyone left the Sterling estate, the news of Julian's arrest spread like wildfire through the city. Opportunistic investors quickly abandoned Julian's company and flocked to Marcus's side. Stock prices plummeted. It was only then, in the clear light of day, that I suddenly remembered who the man in the baseball cap was. His name was Leo, a core member of Julian's executive team who had been with him since the company was founded. I'd seen him at the office several times, and he always greeted me warmly. I had never for a second doubted his loyalty. But he had been at the Sterling estate last night, conspiring with Marcus. I knew with absolute certainty that he was Marcus's mole, and the substantial evidence had come from him. I staggered back to our house, my mind reeling. As I walked through the door, I noticed something was out of place. Julian and I were both meticulous, and our home was always organized in a very specific way. But today the slippers at the entrance had been moved. They weren't like that when we left last night. A sense of dread washed over me. I ran to Julian's study. All of his confidential work files were gone. This wasn't a simple burglary. I immediately called the police and the property management to review the previous night's surveillance footage. The investigation was swift. Chloe was caught. In the interrogation room, I confronted her, demanding to know how she could be so stupid as to use such a clumsy, easily traceable method as theft. "So what?" she said, her face a mask of defiant indifference. "I'll serve a few years in prison. When I get out, he promised he would marry me." Marcus, I realized then that my sister was truly mad, willing to sacrifice her freedom for the slimmest sliver of hope from a man who would never love her. But she was right about one thing. As simple as her operation was, it was devastatingly effective. Marcus now possessed all of Julian's company secrets. Just when I felt despair was about to consume me, the world turned upside down again. Julian was released. He had been completely acquitted of all charges. And at the exact same time, news broke that Marcus had been arrested and imprisoned. The charges were damning: colluding with Leo and Chloe to steal corporate secrets and forging evidence to frame his brother. The list was long enough to keep him behind bars for many years. When I arrived at the police station, it was already dark. Julian was standing alone under a streetlight, still wearing the same coat he had hurriedly thrown on a few nights ago. His solitary figure looked desolate against the night. My eyes immediately reddened, and I ran into his arms, and he held me tightly. "It's okay," he reassured me gently. "Did you really think your husband could be taken down so easily?" He explained that he had known for a long time that Leo was Marcus's man. So, he had purposely kept him close. If you get rid of one spy, another one just takes his place. It was better to keep him where I could see him, control the information he was getting. "You should have told me," I choked out, burying my face in his chest. "I was so worried." He hugged me tighter. It was then that I was surprised to find he was standing perfectly firm, holding me without any of his usual instability or signs of weakness from his leg. I pulled back and looked at him. Under my questioning gaze, he finally confessed. "I needed to keep a low profile to avoid walking into Marcus's traps," he said quietly. "Oh, so you don't need to keep a low profile anymore?" I asked, a hint of my previous grievance still in my voice. "No need," he replied. "Marcus won't be getting out." In my astonished gaze, he gently pressed my head back into his chest. The late autumn wind was chilly, but his embrace was the warmest place in the world. His next words were a low whisper meant only for me. "He killed the old man." He didn't mean Marcus, he meant himself. He had engineered the entire confrontation, knowing it would be the final shock his father's weak heart couldn't take. I was momentarily stunned, and then I snuggled deeper into his arms. I no longer cared if he had been reborn or how many secrets he kept. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that, from now on, he and I were finally free to embrace the powerful, exciting life that truly belonged to us.
Yeah. That's the one. Ginkgo stinko. True that. Save my money. Commish. I wonder how I would do that.
That sounds hard. That sounds like something that might be a challenge for me, and we know that I hate to challenge myself.
See the wide young river flood away.
Okay, Timmy Turner.
Timmy is an average kid. no one understands. Mom and Dad and Vicky always giving him commands. Bad twerp!
A Joshua tree. Yeah! Your pink and green pencils are in fact your odd parents, fairly odd parents. You got me. I've been found out. God, I loved Fairly Odd Parents. Look and go get lunch. Brandy and Joy. Thank you so much. The tree's name is Joshua. There's a Joshua inside the tree. Like, you can help a poor artist get more clients and stuff by sponsoring the first set of California Girls for only like $7.99, you know, like give the gift of giving or something. Like, I don't know. It's like, totally. Has anyone ever told you you're a 20 out of 10? 20 million? Maida, they haven't. They haven't told me that. No one has, ever. You could be the first. So perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Had a cheeky read. Welcome back, Matu! Does anyone else feel like Joshua trees don't look... We were just talking about how they look alien. Or someone in chat mentioned that they look alien. They really do. They look so strange. They're such a weird tree. Weird. They're weird. Yeah. I went to a house that had one in the backyard, which is weird because I don't think they're supposed to. Aha, Erica! Aha! Thank you for the follow. Welcome in. I love Joshua trees. That might be the weed talking. I think it's very fair to love a Joshua tree. To be in love with Joshua tree.